Boston, 1847. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of the Holloway mansion on Beacon Hill, each drop seeming to carry the weight of secrets that would haunt the family for generations. Inside the mahogany-paneled study, Cornelius Holloway sat hunched over his ledger, his weathered hands trembling as he recorded another profitable transaction from his shipping empire. "Father, you summoned me?" Thomas Holloway, 28 and bearing the sharp features that would become the family trademark, entered with measured steps. His expensive coat dripped with rainwater, evidence of his hurried journey from the docks. "Sit down, Thomas." Cornelius's voice carried the authority of a man who had built an empire from nothing. "We need to discuss the future of our enterprise." Thomas settled into the leather chair across from his father's massive desk, noting how the older man's eyes seemed to avoid direct contact. In recent months, Cornelius had become increasingly secretive about the source of their rapidly expanding wealth. "The Pemberton contract was signed today," Cornelius announced, sliding a document across the desk. $50,000 for a single shipment, more than most families see in a lifetime. Thomas picked up the contract, scanning the details. Something felt wrong. The cargo was listed simply as miscellaneous goods, unusually vague for his father's typically meticulous records. "What exactly are we shipping, Father?" "The manifest is rather incomplete." Cornelius stood and walked to the window, watching the gaslit streets of Boston disappear into darkness. "Sometimes, Thomas, success requires us to operate in shadows. The Holloway name will be remembered for centuries, but not all of our methods need to be recorded in history books." "Are you saying we're involved in something illegal?" "I'm saying we're involved in something profitable." Cornelius turned back to his son, his eyes now cold and calculating. "The war with Mexico has created opportunities. Certain government officials need supplies that aren't officially sanctioned. We provide those supplies, and we ask no questions." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "You're talking about arms dealing. Weapons that could end up in the wrong hands." "I'm talking about survival," Cornelius snapped. "Do you think the Astors built their fortune by following every rule? Do you believe the Vanderbilts amassed their wealth through moral superiority? This is America, Thomas. We take what we can get, and we get everything we can take." The younger Holloway set the contract down carefully, his mind racing. He had always suspected his father's business practices were questionable, but this revelation went beyond his worst fears. "What happens if we're discovered? What happens to our family name?" Cornelius returned to his desk and opened a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in red velvet, lay an ornate silver key. The metal was tarnished with age, and strange symbols were etched along its length. "This key," Cornelius said, lifting it reverently, "opens a vault beneath this house. Inside that vault is everything our family has built: contracts, agreements, evidence of transactions that keep powerful men indebted to us. As long as we hold these secrets, we are untouchable." Thomas stared at the key, feeling as though he was looking at the source of something malevolent. "And if something happens to you, then you inherit more than just money, my son. You inherit the responsibility of keeping our family's power intact." Cornelius placed the key back in the box and locked it with a small click. "But understand this: the moment you accept this inheritance, you accept everything that comes with it. The blood on our money, the lives we've affected, the enemies we've made. There's no turning back." Thunder crashed outside, and both men startled. In that moment, Thomas felt as though he was standing at a crossroads that would determine not just his fate, but the fate of every Holloway who would come after him. "I need time to think about this," Thomas said finally. "Time is a luxury we don't have," Cornelius replied, his voice taking on an ominous tone. "There are others who know about our operations. People who would kill to get their hands on what we possess. If you're not ready to protect this family, then perhaps your younger brother Marcus would be more suitable for the task." The mention of Marcus sent a spike of jealousy through Thomas. His brother had always been their father's favorite, charming, ruthless, and completely untroubled by moral considerations. "No," Thomas said firmly. "I'll do whatever is necessary to protect our family." Cornelius smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Good. Because tomorrow, we're expecting a visit from Senator Whitmore. He has a proposal that could make us the most powerful family in New England, but it will require significant commitments." As Thomas left his father's study that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just sealed his family's fate. The rain continued to fall, washing the streets of Boston clean, but no amount of water could cleanse the stain that was already spreading through the Holloway bloodline. Behind him, Cornelius sat alone in his study, staring at the locked box containing the silver key. He whispered words that would echo through generations. What we build in darkness will stand forever, no matter who must fall to keep it standing. Boston, 1847. The next evening, Senator Hamilton Whitmore arrived at the Holloway mansion precisely at 8 o'clock, his black carriage cutting through the fog-shrouded streets like a specter. Thomas watched from the second-floor window as the distinguished politician emerged, noting how the man's eyes darted nervously around the neighborhood before ascending the front steps. "He's here," Thomas announced to his father, who was adjusting his cravat in the hallway mirror. "Remember," Cornelius said, his voice low and serious, "tonight we listen more than we speak. Whitmore needs us more than we need him, but he must never realize that." The butler, Jameson, led Senator Whitmore into the drawing room where a fire crackled warmly in the marble fireplace. Despite the comfortable setting, the atmosphere felt charged with tension. Cornelius, Thomas, Whitmore greeted them, removing his gloves with shaking hands. "Thank you for receiving me on such short notice." "Senator," Cornelius replied with calculated politeness. "Brandy? You look like you could use it." "Yes, thank you." Whitmore accepted the crystal glass gratefully and drained half of it in one gulp. "Gentlemen, I'll be direct. The situation in Washington has become complicated." Thomas studied the senator's face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way his left hand trembled slightly. This was a desperate man. "How complicated?" Cornelius asked, settling into his leather armchair. "The president is pushing for territorial expansion beyond what Congress approved. There are military operations that require funding and equipment, but they can't appear in any official records." Whitmore's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "We need partners who can operate outside traditional channels." "And you thought of us," Thomas said, his tone neutral. "Your father's shipping network is ideal for our needs. Discreet, efficient, and—" Whitmore paused, flexible regarding documentation. Cornelius leaned forward, his business instincts sharpening. "What kind of compensation are we discussing?" $200,000 for the first shipment. More if the arrangement proves satisfactory." The senator pulled out a leather portfolio and spread several documents on the coffee table. "These are routing instructions and cargo specifications." Thomas picked up one of the documents, his eyes widening as he read. "These are military-grade weapons, enough to arm a small army. The destination is listed as Southern Territories," Cornelius observed, reading over his son's shoulder. "Rather vague, wouldn't you say?" Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. "The less specific we are in writing, the better for everyone involved. But I can tell you that these supplies will help ensure American interests are protected in regions where we're expanding our influence." "And if questions are asked," Thomas pressed, "they won't be. I have assurances from the highest levels of government." Whitmore's voice carried a conviction that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Besides, your family's reputation for discretion is well established." Cornelius stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the gaslit street. "Senator, in my experience, when government officials promise that questions won't be asked, it usually means questions are already being asked. I won't lie to you, Cornelius. There are risks, but the rewards." Whitmore gestured to the documents. "This could be the beginning of a very profitable long-term relationship." "What aren't you telling us?" Thomas asked suddenly, his intuition telling him there were crucial details being omitted. The senator hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "There's a congressional investigation beginning next month, led by Senator Morrison. You may know him." Cornelius's face darkened. Morrison was known for his relentless pursuit of corruption and his complete immunity to bribery. "If this arrangement comes to light during that investigation," Thomas said carefully, "what protection would we have?" "Official protection? None." Whitmore's honesty was startling. "But unofficial protection, that's different. The people behind this operation have very long reaches and very deep pockets. Cross them, and you'll wish you'd never been born. Help them, and you'll have allies in the highest echelons of power." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Thomas felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical force. "I need a moment to confer with my son," Cornelius said finally. After Whitmore stepped onto the terrace, father and son faced each other in the flickering firelight. "This is bigger than we realized," Thomas said quietly. "We're not just talking about illegal arms dealing. We're talking about secret government operations, congressional investigations, and people powerful enough to destroy us if we refuse. Or powerful enough to make us untouchable if we agree," Cornelius countered. "Thomas, opportunities like this come once in a lifetime. The question is, do we have the courage to seize it?" Thomas thought of his wife Eleanor, pregnant with their first child, and his younger brother Marcus, studying law at Harvard. What about the family? What about the risks to them? "The greatest risk is remaining small-time operators in a world run by giants," Cornelius said firmly. "If we don't take this chance, someone else will. And when they become the power brokers of New England, where will that leave the Holloways?" When they called Whitmore back inside, Cornelius's decision was already written on his face. "We'll do it," Cornelius announced. "But we want more than money. We want guarantees, protections, and most importantly, we want to be included in future opportunities of this nature." Whitmore's relief was palpable. "Done. I'll have the formal agreements drawn up within the week." As they shook hands, Thomas felt as though he was watching his family's soul being sold. The die was cast, and whatever came next would be written in blood and shadow. After the senator left, Cornelius turned to his son with an expression that seemed almost paternal. "Thomas, tonight we've planted the seeds of a dynasty that will outlast us both. But remember, in this business, trust no one. Completely, not even family. The moment you forget that lesson is the moment you sign your own death warrant." Boston, 1848. 6 months later, the spring morning that would forever change the Holloway family began with deceptive tranquility. Thomas stood in the nursery, watching his infant daughter Sarah sleep peacefully in her crib, unaware that her grandfather was already 3 hours late for their scheduled meeting with Senator Whitmore. "Thomas." Eleanor's voice carried urgency as she rushed into the room, her face pale with worry. "Jameson can't find your father anywhere. His bed wasn't slept in, and his study is in complete disarray." Setting down the letter he'd been reading, another coded message from their Washington contacts, Thomas felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. Cornelius was never late, never unprepared, and never left his study in disorder. "Did you check the vault?" Thomas asked, though he knew his father would never venture there without him present. Jameson checked everywhere. "But Thomas, there's something else." Eleanor's hands trembled as she handed him a telegram. "This arrived an hour ago." The message was brief but terrifying. "Your partner has been asking too many questions. Suggest immediate family vacation. A concerned friend." Thomas read it twice, his mind racing. In their coded correspondence with the Washington Syndicate, asking too many questions meant someone had become a liability. Family vacation was a euphemism for disappearing permanently. "Pack the essentials," Thomas told Eleanor urgently. "We're leaving within the hour." "Thomas, what's happening? Where's your father?" Before he could answer, the front bell chimed. Insistently. Through the nursery window, Thomas saw two men in dark coats standing on their doorstep, men he recognized from previous meetings with Whitmore. "Eleanor, take Sarah and go to your sister's house immediately. Don't stop to pack anything. Else, go now." "Thomas, you're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared." He kissed her forehead quickly. "I'll explain everything later, but right now, you need to trust me and leave." After Eleanor hurried away with the baby, Thomas descended to the main floor where Jameson was speaking in hushed tones with the two men. "Mr. Holloway," the taller man said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "I'm Agent Morrison. We need to discuss your father's recent activities." "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean," Thomas replied carefully, noting how both men kept their hands near their coat pockets. "Your father missed an important meeting last night. Our associates are concerned about his reliability." The shorter man stepped forward. "Mr. Holloway, we found evidence that your father was preparing to cooperate with a congressional investigation. That's very troubling news for everyone involved in our business arrangement." Thomas felt the world shift beneath his feet. His father, the man who had drawn him into this dark world, had apparently been planning to betray their partners. "That's impossible." My father built his entire business on discretion and loyalty. Perhaps, Morrison said smoothly. But old men sometimes lose their nerve, especially when they realize their actions might endanger their grandchildren. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas forced himself to remain calm. What do you want from me? Assurance that the Holloway family remains committed to our arrangement. Your father's shipping network is too valuable to lose due to one man's crisis of conscience. The shorter man produced a document from his coat. This is a new contract, more lucrative than the previous arrangement, but with stricter conditions regarding loyalty and discretion. Thomas scanned the document quickly. The financial terms were indeed impressive, but the penalties for breach of contract were chilling. These terms seem rather permanent. They are, Morrison confirmed. The question is whether you're prepared to honor your family's commitments or whether we need to find alternative arrangements. The implication was clear. Sign the contract or share his father's fate. I need time to review these terms with my legal advisors. I'm afraid time is a luxury we can't provide, the shorter man said. Your father's actions have created a situation that requires immediate resolution. Through the study window, Thomas could see a third man standing beside a black carriage, his stance suggesting military training. The message was unmistakable. They weren't leaving empty-handed. If I sign this, Thomas said slowly, what guarantee do I have regarding my father's whereabouts? Morrison's smile was cold. Mr. Holloway, your father chose his path when he decided to contact Senator Morrison's investigation committee. We're simply offering you the opportunity to choose a different path. With a trembling hand, Thomas picked up his father's fountain pen and signed the document. As the ink dried, he felt as though he was signing away not just his own soul, but the souls of every Holloway who would come after him. Excellent, Morrison said, folding the contract carefully. Your first shipment leaves tomorrow. The cargo will be delivered to your warehouse by midnight tonight. After the men left, Thomas sat alone in his father's study, staring at the locked box that contained the silver key. Slowly, he opened it and lifted out the key, feeling its cold weight in his palm. What have you done to us, father? He whispered to the empty room. That evening, as promised, the cargo arrived. Crates marked only with numbers, no description of contents. But Thomas didn't need to open them to know they contained enough death to fuel a small war that he locked. The warehouse and pocketed the keys. Thomas realized that his father's disappearance was just the beginning. The Holloway family had crossed a line from which there would be no return, and somewhere in the darkness, their enemies were already planning their next move. The transformation was complete. Thomas Holloway was no longer just a shipping merchant. He was now a keeper of deadly secrets, bound by contracts written in blood and enforced by violence. And somewhere in Boston, his father's fate served as a permanent reminder that in this business, loyalty was the only currency that mattered, and betrayal was paid for with life itself. Boston, 1849. 1 year later, the knock on Marcus Holloway's dormitory door at Harvard came at 3 in the morning, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of his brother's strained voice calling his name. When Marcus opened the door, he barely recognized the gaunt, hollow-eyed man standing in the corridor. Thomas, what in God's name are you doing here at this hour? Thomas pushed past his younger brother into the small room, his movements jerky and nervous. Pack your things, Marcus. You're leaving Harvard tonight. I beg your pardon. Marcus lit a lamp, studying his brother's appearance in the flickering light. Thomas had lost considerable weight. His expensive clothes now hung loosely on his frame, and his hands shook with a barely controlled tremor. Father is dead, Thomas said bluntly. Murdered, and they're coming for the rest of us. Marcus felt the words hit him like a physical blow. Despite their father's mysterious disappearance a year ago, he had held on to hope that Cornelius might still be alive somewhere. Who killed him? How do you know? Thomas pulled out a blood-stained letter and handed it to his brother. The paper was expensive, the kind their father had always used for important correspondence, but the handwriting was shaky and desperate. My sons, the letter began. If you are reading this, then I am already dead. The business arrangements I made have become a trap that will destroy our family unless you act quickly. The vault beneath the house contains evidence that could hang us all, but it also contains the only weapons we have against our enemies. Trust no one in Washington. Trust no one in Boston. Trust only each other, and even then, Be careful. The silver key opens more than just a vault. It opens the gates of hell itself. May God forgive us all. Cornelius Holloway. Marcus read the letter twice, his legal training helping him process the implications. Thomas, what business arrangements? What vault? What enemies? For the next hour, Thomas revealed everything. The arms dealing, the government. Contracts, the shadowy partners who had claimed their father's life. As the story unfolded, Marcus felt his comfortable world of law books and academic debates crumbling around him. So let me understand this correctly, Marcus said when Thomas finished. Our family fortune is built on illegal weapons trafficking. Our father was murdered by government agents, and now they want us to continue the operation or face the same fate. That's the situation in its simplest terms, yes. Marcus stood and walked to his window, staring out at the peaceful Harvard yard. In a few hours, his classmates would be attending lectures on constitutional law and moral philosophy, concepts that now seemed laughably naive. What about Eleanor and Sarah? Are they safe? For now, I sent them to stay with Eleanor's family in Philadelphia. But our enemies have long memories and longer reaches. Thomas joined his brother at the window. Marcus, I know this isn't the life you wanted. You were going to be a lawyer, maybe a judge someday. But we're Holloways, and whether we like it or not, that name comes with obligations. Obligations? Marcus turned to face his brother, anger flashing in his eyes. You mean curses? Father cursed our family when he made that first deal, and now you want me to help perpetuate that curse. I want you to help me find a way out of it. Thomas's voice carried a desperation that made Marcus's anger fade into concern. The contracts I signed can't be broken through normal legal channels. But you're smarter than I am, Marcus. You understand law and politics in ways I never could. Maybe you can find something I've missed. Marcus considered his options. He could refuse to get involved, finish his law degree, and hope the family's enemies would leave him alone. But looking at his brother's haunted expression, he realized that hope was likely futile. Show me everything, Marcus said finally. Every contract, every document, every piece of evidence. If we're going to fight our way out of this hell, I need to understand exactly what we're fighting. They returned to Boston before dawn, traveling in a rented carriage with the curtains drawn. The Holloway mansion felt different now, darker, more oppressive, as though the walls themselves were stained with guilt. In the basement vault, behind a concealed door that the silver key unlocked, Marcus found himself staring at the evidence of his family's sins. Contracts for arms shipments, correspondence with government officials, photographs of cargo being loaded onto Holloway ships, and financial records showing payments that could fund small armies. My God, Marcus whispered, reading through a particularly damning letter from Senator Whitmore. This goes all the way to the president's cabinet. Now you understand why simply walking away isn't an option, Thomas said grimly. These people don't let their business partners retire. They let them die. Marcus spent the next several hours studying the documents with the analytical mind that had made him Harvard's top law student. Gradually, a pattern began to emerge. Thomas, look at this. Marcus spread several contracts across the vault floor. These shipping dates, the cargo descriptions, the routing information, there are inconsistencies. Some of these shipments were going to different destinations than what's listed in the official contracts. What does that mean? It means our father was playing a more complex game than we realized. He wasn't just fulfilling government contracts. He was also dealing with private buyers. And look at these financial records. Marcus pointed to a series of deposits. He was being paid twice for the same shipments. Thomas studied the documents his brother indicated. He was stealing from our government partners. Worse than that, he was selling the same weapons to opposing factions, government forces and rebel groups, Union supporters and Confederate sympathizers. Marcus's voice carried a mixture of admiration and horror. Father wasn't just an arms dealer. He was playing both sides of every conflict he could find. The implications were staggering. If their government partners discovered that Cornelius had been selling them out, it would explain both his murder and the continuing threat to his sons. But this also gives us leverage, Marcus continued, his legal mind working furiously. If we can prove that our government contacts were involved in illegal activities, we might be able to negotiate our freedom. Or we might end up like Father, dead in an unmarked grave. Marcus looked at his brother with new determination. Thomas, we have two choices. We can continue being victims of father's deals, or we can become players in our own right. But if we choose to fight, we have to be smarter, more ruthless, and more careful than father ever was. As the sun rose over Boston, the two brothers stood in their father's vault, surrounded by the evidence of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of American government. They were no longer the shipping merchant and the law student. They were now partners in a deadly game where the stakes were their family's survival. "All right, Marcus," Thomas said finally. "Teach me how to fight devils with law books." "First lesson," Marcus replied, his voice taking on a hardness that would have surprised his Harvard professors. "In this business, the only difference between justice and revenge is who's holding the evidence." Boston, 1854. 5 years later, the Holloway brothers had learned to play the game well. Too well, perhaps. Thomas stood at the window of their new offices on State Street, watching the bustling commercial district below while Marcus reviewed the latest correspondence from their Washington contacts. The shipping business had grown exponentially, and with it, their entanglement in the shadowy world of government contracts and private arrangements. "The Kansas situation is deteriorating rapidly," Marcus announced, setting down a coded telegram. "Our contacts want us to expedite the next shipment by 2 weeks." Thomas turned from the window, noting the weariness in his younger brother's voice. 5 years of constant vigilance and moral compromise had aged them both beyond their years. Which shipment? The official government supplies, or the private arrangement with the Missouri faction? Both, actually. That's the problem. Marcus rubbed his temples, a gesture that had become habitual when dealing with their increasingly complex web of obligations. "They're asking us to arm both sides of what's essentially a civil war, and they want it done simultaneously." The irony wasn't lost on either brother. They had survived their father's fate by becoming more cautious and more clever than Cornelius had ever been. But in doing so, they had also become more deeply compromised. "Thomas, we need to talk about Eleanor." The mention of his wife's name caused Thomas to stiffen. Eleanor had returned from Philadelphia the previous year, but their marriage had never recovered from the secrets and lies that now dominated their lives. "What about Eleanor?" "She's been asking questions. Jameson told me she was in the vault yesterday, looking through the financial records." Marcus's voice carried a warning tone. "She's not stupid, Thomas. She knows something's wrong." Thomas felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in his stomach. Eleanor had grown increasingly suspicious of his frequent absences and mysterious business meetings. Her questions had become more pointed, her silences more accusatory. "I'll handle Eleanor." "Will you?" "Because last night she asked me directly whether our family was involved in illegal activities. I deflected the question, but she's not going to accept evasion much longer." Before Thomas could respond, the office door opened and Eleanor herself entered, accompanied by their 6-year-old daughter Sarah. The child ran to her father immediately, but Eleanor's expression was cold and determined. "Sarah, go play in Uncle Marcus's office while I speak with your father," Eleanor said firmly. After the child left, Eleanor faced her husband with the steel resolve that had first attracted him to her years ago. "Thomas, I've been patient. I've accepted your excuses, your absences, your secrecy. But this morning I received a visit from Mrs. Patterson." Thomas felt his blood chill. Mrs. Patterson was the widow of a congressional investigator who had died under mysterious circumstances 6 months earlier. "She told me that her husband was investigating government corruption involving shipping companies when he died." She specifically mentioned the Holloway name. Eleanor's voice remained steady, but her hands were trembling. "Thomas, I need you to tell me the truth. What are you and Marcus really doing?" Marcus stood up from his desk, recognizing the gravity of the moment. "Eleanor, perhaps it would be better if—" "No, Marcus. I'm not leaving this office until I get honest answers." Eleanor turned back to her husband. "Thomas," our daughter asked me yesterday why her father always looks scared. A 6-year-old child can see what's happening to you. What's happening to our family?" Thomas looked at his wife, the woman who had married a promising young businessman and found herself trapped in a nightmare of conspiracy and violence. The weight of his secrets felt crushing. "Eleanor, there are things about our business that are complicated, don't." Eleanor's voice cut through his attempt at deflection like a blade. "Don't insult my intelligence with more lies. I've seen the documents in the vault. I've noticed the men who watch our house. I've heard you and Marcus whispering about contracts and arrangements and eliminating problems. Tell me the truth, or I'm taking Sarah and leaving Boston tonight." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword. Thomas looked at Marcus, seeing his own desperation reflected in his brother's eyes. "The truth," Thomas said slowly, "is that our father made a deal with the devil, and now the devil owns our souls." For the next hour, Thomas and Marcus revealed everything to Eleanor. They told her about the arms dealing, the government contracts, their father's murder, and the continuing threats that kept them trapped in an increasingly dangerous game. As the story unfolded, Eleanor's face went through a series of expressions: shock, horror, disgust, and finally, a cold calculation that surprised both brothers. "So our options are to continue this business or to die," Eleanor said when they finished. "That's correct," Marcus confirmed. Eleanor was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the busy street below. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a hardness neither brother had ever heard before. "Then we need to make sure we're the ones who survive." Thomas stared at his wife in amazement. "Eleanor, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that if we're trapped in this situation, then we need to control it instead of being controlled by it." Eleanor turned to face them both. "You've been playing defense for 5 years. Maybe it's time to play offense." Marcus leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "What do you mean?" "I mean that blackmail works both ways. If these government officials are using you to conduct illegal activities, then you have evidence that could destroy them. Why haven't you used it?" "Because using it would mean revealing our own crimes," Thomas pointed out. "Not necessarily." Eleanor's voice took on the tone of someone working through a complex problem. "What if there was a way to expose their crimes while protecting ourselves? What if we could make them more afraid of us than we are of them?" The brothers exchanged glances. Eleanor's suggestion was dangerous, but it was also the first potentially viable escape plan they had considered in years. "Eleanor," Marcus said carefully, "what you're proposing could get us all killed." "What we're doing now is going to get us all killed eventually," Eleanor replied. "The only question is whether we die as victims or as players in our own right." As the sun set over Boston that evening, the three conspirators sat in the Holloway vault, surrounded by the evidence of their family's dark history, planning a gambit that would either free them from their nightmare or destroy them all. Eleanor looked up from the documents she was studying and spoke words that would define the Holloway family's future. "If we're going to be criminals, then let's be the best criminals Boston has ever seen." Boston, 1861. 7 years later, the Civil War had made the Holloway family incredibly wealthy and incredibly vulnerable. As cannons roared across America's battlefields, the brothers had supplied weapons to both Union and Confederate forces, playing a deadly game that had finally attracted the attention of the one man they had always feared: President Lincoln himself. Marcus burst into the family mansion's study where Thomas and Eleanor were reviewing shipping manifests, his face pale with terror. "They know everything," he gasped, waving a telegram. "Lincoln has ordered a full investigation of war profiteering. They're coming for us." Eleanor looked up from her ledger, her expression remarkably calm for a woman whose world was about to collapse. "When federal marshals will be here tomorrow morning. They have warrants for both Thomas and me and seizure orders for all our assets." Marcus collapsed into a chair, the weight of their situation crushing his composure. "Eleanor, they found the Patterson documents." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. The Patterson documents were their insurance policy, evidence of government corruption that they had planned to use as leverage if they were ever cornered. If the federal investigators had found those papers, it meant their enemies in Washington had decided to eliminate the Holloway problem permanently. "How is that possible?" Thomas demanded. "Those documents were hidden in 3 different locations. Someone betrayed us," Eleanor said quietly, her voice carrying deadly certainty. "Someone with access to our most sensitive information." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made all 3 freeze. They weren't expecting anyone, and unexpected visitors had become synonymous with death threats in recent years. Jameson appeared in the doorway, his elderly face grim. "Sir, your brother Marcus is here to see you." Thomas and Eleanor exchanged confused glances. Marcus was sitting right beside them. "That's impossible, Jameson." "Marcus is." The older Marcus Holloway stepped into the study, flanked by 2 federal agents. He was Thomas's younger brother, but this was not the man who had been helping run their illegal operations for the past decade. This Marcus wore the uniform of a Union Army colonel and carried himself with the bearing of a man who had found his true calling. "Hello, Thomas." "Eleanor." The uniformed Marcus's voice was steady and cold. "I believe you've been expecting this visit." Thomas stared at his brother in shock and growing comprehension. "You're working with them. You've been working with them. All along." "Not all along," Marcus replied, removing his military cap. "But for the past 2 years, yes. Since I realized that our family's activities were prolonging this war and costing thousands of American lives." Eleanor stood slowly, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. "You sanctimonious bastard. We trusted you with everything. And I trusted you with my soul," Marcus shot back. "Do you have any idea what it's like to know that weapons you helped ship killed boys from your own Harvard class? Do you know what it feels like to realize you've become everything you once despised?" One of the federal agents stepped forward, producing a thick folder. "Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, I'm Agent Harrison with the Treasury Department. You're both under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and violation of federal wartime regulations." Thomas felt the world spinning around him. "Marcus, what about Sarah? What about our daughter?" For the first time, the uniformed Marcus showed emotion. A flicker of pain crossed his features. "Sarah will be cared for. She'll be raised by Eleanor's sister in Philadelphia, away from all of this." "Away from her parents, you mean?" Eleanor said bitterly. "Away from criminals," Marcus corrected. "Thomas, Eleanor, you had choices. Every step of the way, you had choices. You chose profit over principle, secrecy over honesty, and power over family." The other federal agent produced shackles, but Thomas barely noticed them. His mind was reeling with the implications of his brother's betrayal. "The silver key," Thomas said suddenly. "You have access to the vault. You've had access to everything." Marcus nodded grimly. "I copied every document, every contract, every piece of evidence. The government has been building a case against our Washington contacts for months. Your testimony will help complete that case." "And if we refuse to testify?" Eleanor asked. Agent Harrison answered before Marcus could speak. "Then you'll hang for treason. Both of you. The evidence is overwhelming." As the shackles clicked around his wrists, Thomas looked at his brother with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. "You planned this perfectly, didn't you? You waited until we were too deep to escape. Then you offered us up as sacrifices to save your own conscience." "I offered you chances to get out," Marcus replied quietly. "For years, I suggested we find a way to end our involvement. You and Eleanor always chose to go deeper instead." Eleanor laughed bitterly as her own shackles were applied. "And now you get to play the hero while we rot in prison. How convenient for your political aspirations, Colonel Holloway." The accusation hit its mark. Marcus flinched, but didn't deny it as they were led from the mansion. Thomas took one last look at the study where his father had first drawn him into this nightmare. The irony was overwhelming. The family that had built its fortune on betrayal was ultimately destroyed by betrayal. "Marcus," Thomas called as they reached the front door. "What happens to the family name? What happens to the Holloway legacy?" His brother paused at the threshold, silhouetted against the Boston sunset. "The Holloway name dies with you and Eleanor. Sarah will take her aunt's surname and hopefully never know the truth about what her parents became." "And you?" Eleanor asked. "What about your conscience, Marcus? Will you be able to live with what you've done to your own family?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that made him sound decades older. "I'll live with the knowledge that I helped end a corrupt operation that was prolonging a war and costing American lives. Whether I can live with destroying my family in the process, I suppose I'll find out." As the carriage pulled away from the Holloway mansion, Thomas looked back at the house where 4 generations of his family had lived and schemed and died. The windows glowed warmly in the evening light, but the building felt already like a tomb. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "do you think we could have chosen differently? Do you think there was ever a way out that didn't end like this?" Eleanor was staring straight ahead, her face set in hard lines. "No, Thomas. From the moment your father made that first deal, our fate was sealed. The only choice we ever really had was how long to delay the inevitable." "And Sarah? What kind of life will she have, knowing her parents died as traitors?" "She won't know," Eleanor said firmly. Marcus will make sure of that. She'll grow up believing we died in some acceptable way, disease, accident, anything but the truth. Thomas closed his eyes, trying to imagine his daughter as a grown woman, living a normal life free from the shadows that had consumed her family. It was a small comfort, but perhaps it was enough. Maybe that's for the best, he said. Finally, their carriage disappeared into the Boston night. The Holloway mansion stood empty for the first time in 60 years. In the basement vault, the silver key lay forgotten on the floor, surrounded by the scattered evidence of a family's descent into darkness. The Holloway dynasty, built on blood and maintained through betrayal, had finally consumed itself. But in the darkness of their downfall, there was perhaps one small victory. Sarah Holloway would have the chance to live the kind of life her parents had abandoned long ago. The family name would indeed die, but maybe, just maybe, the family soul could finally find peace. Boston, 1912, 50 years later Dr. Sarah Mitchell, née Holloway, stood before the massive oak doors of what had once been her family's mansion, now converted into a historical society. At 57, she was a respected physician in Philadelphia, known for her work with war veterans and her advocacy for medical reform. She had lived her entire adult life believing her parents died in a carriage accident when she was 7 years old. Dr. Mitchell, the young archivist who had contacted her, James Wellington, approached nervously. "Thank you for coming. I know this must be difficult." Sarah studied the building's facade, feeling an inexplicable chill despite the warm October afternoon. "Mr. Wellington, your letter mentioned that you had discovered documents related to my family's history. Documents that contradict what I've been told my entire life." "Yes, ma'am. Perhaps we should discuss this inside." The interior of the mansion had been converted into research rooms and archive storage, but Sarah could still sense the grandeur that had once defined these halls. Wellington led her to a private study where a collection of documents lay spread across a large table. "Dr. Mitchell, I should warn you that what I'm about to show you may be quite disturbing. The Historical Society acquired these papers from a federal archive that was being cleaned out. They've been classified for 50 years. Sarah approached the table, her medical training having taught her to face unpleasant truths directly. "Mr. Wellington, I've seen enough suffering in my career to handle whatever you've discovered. Please, show me what you found." The first document Wellington handed her was a federal arrest warrant dated 1861, bearing the names Thomas and Eleanor Holloway, her parents. "This is impossible," Sarah said, scanning the charges. "Treason? Arms dealing? My parents were respectable shipping merchants who died in an accident." "I'm afraid not, Dr. Mitchell. Your parents were arrested for selling weapons to both sides during the Civil War. They were convicted of treason and executed in 1862. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She sank into a nearby chair, her mind reeling with the implications. "But my uncle Marcus, he told me they died in a carriage accident. He raised me, educated me, supported my medical studies. Why would he lie about something so fundamental?" Wellington hesitated before producing another document. "Because, Dr. Mitchell, your uncle Marcus was the one who turned them in to the federal authorities." The revelation was like a dagger to Sarah's heart. The man she had loved and respected as a father figure, the uncle who had encouraged her humanitarian instincts and supported her unconventional career choices, had been responsible for her parents' deaths. "There's more," Wellington continued gently. "Your uncle Marcus became quite prominent in Republican politics after the war. He served 2 terms in Congress and was considered for a cabinet position. His war service and his role in exposing the weapons trafficking ring made him a national hero." Sarah stared at a photograph of Uncle Marcus in his military uniform, surrounded by other Union officers. The man in the picture looked noble and principled, everything she had believed him to be. "Tell me about my parents," she said quietly. "Tell me who they really were." For the next 2 hours, Wellington laid out the complete history of the Holloway family's criminal enterprise. Sarah learned about her grandfather Cornelius's mysterious disappearance, her parents' gradual descent into corruption, and the complex web of government contracts and private arrangements that had made the family wealthy and ultimately destroyed them. "Dr. Mitchell, there's one more thing." Wellington produced a small wooden box from beneath the table. This was found in the mansion's basement. The federal agents missed it during their initial investigation. Inside the box was the silver key that had unlocked so many family secrets. Attached to it was a note in her father's handwriting. For Sarah, may you find the strength to break the chains that bound our family. Choose light over darkness, service over profit, truth over comfort. Be everything we failed to become. Your father, Thomas Holloway. Sarah held the key, feeling its cold weight in her palm. He knew, she whispered. Even at the end, he knew what they had become. Dr. Mitchell, what will you do with this information? The Historical Society would like to publish these findings as part of a study on Civil War profiteering, but we wanted your permission first. Sarah was quiet for a long time, considering the question. Publishing the truth would destroy her uncle's legacy and expose her family's dark history to public scrutiny. But keeping it secret would mean continuing the cycle of lies that had defined the Holloway name for generations. Mr. Wellington, my entire career has been built on healing and helping others. I've spent decades trying to undo the damage caused by war and violence. If I suppress this information, I become complicit in the very corruption that destroyed my family. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the same Boston streets her grandfather had walked while planning his first illegal shipment. Publish everything, she said firmly. Let the world know what the Holloway family really was. But also let them know that not all legacies have to be inherited. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give to the future is the refusal to repeat the sins of the past. Wellington nodded respectfully. And the key, Dr. Mitchell? What should we do with it? Sarah looked at the silver key one more time, thinking of all the secrets it had unlocked, all the doors it had opened to corruption and violence. Then, with a decisive motion, she walked to the fireplace and dropped it into the flames. Some doors should never be opened again, she said, watching the metal begin to glow in the heat. The Holloway curse ends here. As the key melted in the fire, Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For 50 years, she had lived with a vague sense that something was missing from her family's story. Now she knew the truth, and with that truth came the power to choose a different path. Mr. Wellington, when you publish this history, I want you to include one more thing. What's that, Dr. Mitchell? Include the story of every life I've saved as a physician. Include the hospitals I've helped build, the veterans I've treated, the medical reforms I've supported. Sarah turned from the fireplace with renewed determination. Let people know that even a family cursed by greed and violence can produce something good if someone chooses to make it so. As Sarah left the mansion that evening, she carried with her the complete knowledge of her family's dark legacy. But she also carried something more powerful, the absolute certainty that the Holloway name would finally, truly die with her. The curse that had begun with Cornelius Holloway's first illegal contract was finally broken. Not through violence or betrayal, but through the simple choice of one woman to dedicate her life to healing rather than harming, to truth rather than profit, to light rather than darkness. The Holloway dynasty was dead. But from its ashes, Dr. Sarah Mitchell had built something better, a life devoted to undoing the very kind of damage her family had once caused. Standing on the Boston street, where 4 generations of her family had schemed and betrayed and died, Sarah Mitchell smiled for the first time in months. Tomorrow, she would return to Philadelphia and continue her work healing the wounds of war. The silver key was gone. The secrets were revealed. The curse was broken. The Holloway family's macabre history had finally come to an end.